Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are here for the February 2012 Economic Update, the monthly presentation that the Brecht Forum has been producing for quite a while now. So I'm happy to welcome you. My task, as always, is to go over some of the major economic developments, both inside the United States and in the world, in order to present a different way of understanding them, also to give some background so that they become intelligible rather than just momentary blips on an evening TV program that goes in one ear or in one eye and out the other. This month, I have too many things. As I sat around today to try to figure out what to focus on, there were too many. I'm also pleased that several of you have sent me emails giving me suggestions as to what I should cover, which is a good sign. We call that interactivity, and it's supposed to be a very good thing. And I'm glad you did it. It gave me something to think about. Because so many of you who did send me emails wanted me to talk about Greece, for obvious reasons, I will do that and try to bring us up to date in terms of what is happening there. But there really were many, many things. So bear with me. This is a selection. There's no particular reason why I picked these as opposed to other things. They struck me as important. And often they strike me because the way they are treated in the media is so upsetting to me, because of the angle of approach, and mostly because of what's left out, that it becomes a kind of pressure on me to try to fill in. So let's begin. One of the major announcements last week was a program to deal with the housing crisis here in the United States, and in particular with the foreclosure crisis. So let's be sure we all know what this is and why it's important. We have had several million people in the United States since the crisis begins late in 2007. We've had several million people thrown out of their homes. And we have several more million people already at some point in the foreclosure process. That is a legal process in which a lender who's not getting paid back by the people who borrowed money to buy the house or the apartment, the lender has the right, after a certain number of months of payment have been missed, to go into court and to go through a legal procedure basically saying that the person, because he or she is not paying, should be thrown out of the house, and whatever collateral backs up that loan is given to the lender to compensate the lender for whatever losses the lender may take in the fact that they now possess a property which is no longer paying them a monthly mortgage payment, and they now have to dispose of that property. So stay with me as we see what this means. Number one, it sticks lenders, who are mostly banks, with a mountain of properties. Banks are not in the property management business. They don't know about, they don't have mechanisms to deal with huge numbers of houses or apartments that they have suddenly become the owner of because they threw out the person who borrowed to live in there. That person's now gone or about to go, and the property reverts to the lender. Banks are stuck with houses. That would be bad enough because they don't know what to do with that. But the problem is they're stuck with houses which are going down in value. Why? Because everybody's stuck with houses and nobody can afford a house. And people who are not in trouble with their banks are also trying to sell their house because they can't afford to stay in there anymore. And so we have a situation, we've had that now for 4.5 years, of an excess supply of housing on the market driving down the price. So if you're a lender who forecloses on people, you're getting stuck with a property you don't want, that has management costs you don't want to have to deal with, And that is frightening you because every day that you're the bank that owns the house, the value of the house you own is going down. This is causing banks a lot of grief. With many banks, it meant that a peculiar thing happened over the last few years that doesn't get much attention. One, they didn't foreclose. They basically... Yes, I can see that. Thank you. Thank you very much. The problem of the housing market became one in which banks said, we don't want to get stuck with the property. Even if we throw a person out, it'll take us months to go through the paperwork, the legalities, finding a buyer, reaching an agreed price. During that time, we're at risk. So here's what we'll do. We'll let the people who are not paying stay there for months at a time. Because if they're in there, there'll be less danger. Maybe we can cut a deal where they give us a little bit a month, way less than what they ought to have paid, but it will be ahead compared to what we will have if we don't. So you get a peculiar overhang of people who really can't afford to be in that place, but stay there for a few months at a time, which means those of us trying to understand the condition of the housing market have a hard time figuring out just how bad it is. Or to say the same thing another way, it's a lot worse than it seems. A lot of the people that are still in their homes are only there so long as the bank calculates it's better for them to let them stay there for little or no money than to finally throw them out. Number two, as banks work this out, because they're getting better at it, being stuck with millions of homes now banks own, they have figured out now ways to dump them. And they do that. And they do it in a number of ways. What they don't want to do, although many of them are doing it for fear, what they didn't want to do was simply to sell those houses quickly. Because imagine if lots of banks around the country, possessed of lots of empty houses, suddenly start dumping them. What do you think is going to happen to the value of housing in the United States? Boom. And as the value of housing goes down, and remember, a house, an apartment or a home, is the only real wealth most Americans have. Huge number of Americans have no wealth. They have no store of wealth. They live paycheck to paycheck, end of story. For those Americans who have some wealth, that wealth is their home. It's more important than all their other wealth combined. Therefore, what does it mean in a society where the only wealth that the mass of people have any chance to own is the one going down? Housing has dropped approximately, on an average in this country, 35% today from what it was at the beginning of this crisis. So the single most important piece of wealth that most Americans own has dropped catastrophically in the last few years. That has enormous economic, as psychological and other consequences. If I had more time, I would talk to you about. But we have had a depressed housing market in the United States now for 4 years. Falling prices, a tremendous overhang that has completely stifled most home building projects in America. Try to think of yourself if you were a builder of homes. Are you going to undertake the expenses of investing in building homes when at any time that overhang could be disgorged onto the market, driving down the prices and making you lose vast amounts? That has held back the housing industry. We don't build houses anywhere like what we used to. Therefore, we do not have a market for furniture the way we used to, for appliances, because none of that is happening the way it used to. And the whole thing is a major drag on the American economy. If you saw what lifted the American economy in the years before the crisis, it was a housing boom, fueled by debt, fueled by easy mortgages, fueled by low interest rates. And that really carried the economy up as houses were built. And if you built more houses, you had to build roads to the houses. That gave lots of people jobs, and to build the houses and to build the furniture and the appliances and the plumbing and the sewer pipes and all the well, just think of all of that in reverse. And then you have a sense of where we are in the last few years. Okay, one of the complications of this was that the price of housing having come down so much, we had a new phenomenon that we hadn't dealt with before as a nation. We had millions of people who had seen the value of their house go down over the last 4 or 5 years, so much that they now owe on the house more money than the house is worth. If you buy, I mean roughly, if you buy a $100,000 house and you take out a 20 or 25-year mortgage, which is common, you will end up paying over those 20, 25 years 2 to 3 times the $100,000. The actual will lay out $200,000 to $300,000 for your $100,000 house. Your debts will be that big because the interest that accumulates and so on. So Americans are now finding themselves, millions of them, in a situation where they possess only one kind of property, a house, whose value to them is negative. It's not that they don't have a valuable property, they have the oddest property of all, a property that is worth less than zero. You have to try to get your head around that, which is hard for most Americans because they don't want to understand something which is terrifying in its implication. That if they stay in the house, they will end up paying a lot more money than the house is worth that they're buying over time with money they can't afford. It's a little hard. The government has been asked by desperate homeowners since the crisis hit, do something. Help us. We are losing our homes. We are destroying the economy because the housing industry is kaput. I won't even go into the obvious, which is we have a country with a record number of homeless people today who are sitting across the street looking at the empty houses of which we have millions. And while the house is empty, because the people who were in it got thrown out, vandals, teenagers, drug dealers, you get the picture, are moving into the house, plus the house is deteriorating, the weeds are growing, you know the picture. So we are losing the housing stock while the housing is empty and the homeless people stare at the process, as the rest of us do. This is not an economic system that works. This is an economic system that doesn't work, which you'll see is a theme all night tonight. Almost everything I'm going to say to you has that as the punchline. So you can start laughing early since you know where I'm going with it. So what happened in this situation was a desperate demand for help. We have actually had 3 programs already, starting in 2007, that were designed to help homeowners in trouble. If you remember back in 2008, one of the first programs, when there weren't so many acronyms, you kind of remember them, TARP, T-A-R-P, remember reading about that? Well, the TARP program, a big money program of the government, actually pushed through when Bush was still president, the end of 2008. It had a part of it that was supposed to provide some of that money to help homeowners. By the way, a homeowner who owes more on his or her house than it's worth is called a homeowner who is, you'll love this phrase, underwater. You are if you read that in the paper, underwater means you're in that bizarre situation. None of those programs worked. And the reason is simple. Every one of those programs required the cooperation of the banks in the United States. They're the ones who own the mortgage. They do not want people to get out of their mortgage. They do not want people to be able to write off the mortgage. They want those people to have to pay. And if those people don't pay, they want to be able to take the house and hopefully dispose of it and end up with more money in their pocket than the alternative. So since the banks had to cooperate and were very resistant, those programs didn't help very many people. And so the pressure has been rising as the number of foreclosed homes have increased. And that came to a head in the program announced a week ago Monday by the Obama administration. And they announced with great fanfare, Sean Donovan, the Secretary of Housing, led the way. You may remember him. He used to do the same job for Bloomberg here in New York before Obama picked him to go to Washington. And here's what they announced, with big numbers. Americans like these numbers. 26, that was the number, $26 billion has been appropriated, or Obama will want to appropriate, to help underwater people facing foreclosure, or even people who have suffered from foreclosure. Okay, $26 billion. What is the amount of money that Americans now owe that is greater than the asset they're paying on is worth? What is the shortfall between the amount owed that people really can't find the money for and the actual value they live in? $700 billion. Okay? If you want to help people with a problem that's at least roughly demonstrably in the neighborhood of $700 billion, well then $26 billion isn't a whole lot. And that's why it's really important that you forget that number 700, because then you can focus on 26 billion and it'll sound like a lot. But the minute you understand the scope of the problem, it's silly. When you look further into the legislation, and the details of it are still not out. So they announced that they would be doing this, but the details will come later. The details are crucial here. But one detail that emerged is, for many people who lost their home, for whom the foreclosure is already a past event, they will be getting, if all goes well, and within a year or two, $2,000. Now, you're laughing, and I understand why you're laughing, and I want you to laugh. But another part of you should be crying. This is a catastrophe for millions of people, and they're going to get, having lost their homes, $2,000. Last point. Many houses are excluded, by the way. Roughly half the houses in the United States, half the homes, the mortgage holder, the ultimate lender who actually owns the mortgage, is the federal government. So the ultimate lender for half the homes in America is the government. I'm going to come back in a little bit later and tell you about the ways that the government helps this economy. But one clue to how the government is an important factor in the American economy, Republican and Democratic candidates notwithstanding, is that little fact I just gave you. Half of the mortgages in this country are owned by the United States government. That's the ultimate lender to the American people, without which they wouldn't get a mortgage. Nobody else is going to lend it to them. Gee, can you imagine what would happen to the housing market if the government didn't invest all that money to lend to half the people with homes? Why, those people couldn't get a mortgage. Or they'd have to pay a lot more for it, and then a lot fewer would be able to afford it. And with a lot fewer people able to buy houses, what do you think would happen to the value? I don't know, your house. So everyone in this room who owns his or her apartment or house is currently enjoying a value of that house that is much higher than it would be if the free enterprise private market were to determine its value. Luckily for you, the government is shoring it all up with vast amounts of money that are creating half the demand for housing in the United States. So when all of the dust clears, what happened last week was a big media event. It may help Obama because he looks like he's trying to do something for people with troubled home situations. And he is. It is, as one can always say, better than nothing, but not by a lot. And that's what you have to keep in mind. Last point about housing. No one calculates what I'm about to tell you, but the minute I tell you, you'll know how and why it's important. What does it mean that millions of Americans have been thrown out of their houses and homes in the last few years? What does it mean that many millions more are very worried about the prospect of that happening to them next month, next year, because they're at the edge? Well, you don't need an advanced degree in psychology to understand it is profoundly disruptive to people's lives to be thrown out of their homes. It is profoundly disruptive and anxiety-creating to be worried about whether you can survive in your home. It distresses you, it distresses your spouse, it disrupts the life of your children, and it's very easy to show, there have been studies, that the kind of disruption produced by the mass ejection of people from their homes impacts how well students do in school, impacts the productivity of the adults who go to work from a distressed household like that and can't get their mind around what they're doing. It disrupts and undermines people's education. You get the picture. The social cost of what is being done to the American people around housing is staggering. In the face of that, a program with massive publicity that offers $26 billion is really a tragic joke. Nor is it clear that they'll even get that program underway or that they'll even care about it once the election is over, for which it was clearly designed. Let me turn next to a second thing that happened, and I'll be brief on this one. And I don't mean to pick on the Apple Corporation. I don't mean to. But they really ask for it. I know that many of you enjoy Apple products of one kind or another, and I'm not in any way critical of that, or of Steve Jobs, recently departed, or the technological breakthrough. I don't dispute that. That's not what I'm interested in. What I'm interested in is the spate of publicity, very bad for the company, that has come out over the last few weeks, particularly since our last monthly update. And what this publicity is about had to do with where most of the product, the actual Apple iPod or Apple computer that you have, where it is manufactured. And it turns out many of them are manufactured by a company in China, very, very large company, one of the biggest in China, that has facilities all over the place, a company called Foxconn. And some of you have read about this. If not, you can just Google it and you'll find out all about it. And the conditions of workers in these Chinese plants is abysmal. They're underpaid, they're overworked. Many of you saw a photograph of one of the factories that has netting all around the edge of the factory. And the reason the netting is there, as is made clear, and they don't deny it, is to catch the suicides of the workers that are stressed beyond endurance and leap off the building to kill themselves. Apple doesn't want that, and so it catches them in the net and sends them back in to the building, which is an act of compassion that all of you should stop and recognize for what it is. Here's the important point. Apple is not doing anything unusual. This is common. The same Foxconn that gets exposed for Apple is also making components for many other products, including many that you would see in any electronics store here in the United States. The way this works is simple. The different companies compete to get you to buy their brand versus another. And how do you do that in a capitalist system? You look for the cheapest possible place to get the product made. And that creates competition. You know, the thing that you hear at the Kiwanis Club on the fourth Monday of every month when the businessmen in the community get together for lunch and listen to one of their number say whatever it is that they have to listen to before dessert. In that situation, they will talk about competition and its wonderful results. I now want to present to you competition with other kind of results. Apple, like all of its competitors, put out the details of the production they need to have made of the iPod or the computer for bidding. And they get all the little companies, or not so little companies, all over the world anxious for the contract. Why? Well, you can imagine. Apple is a very successful company. They want you to make lots of whatever it is. So if you get the contract, you can hire lots of people, build lots of factories, and make a lot of profit by making the thing for Apple. Or so you think. So you offer a wonderful bid, and you get the contract. And then you hire a lot of people, and you invest a lot of money because you're going to be producing millions of iPods for Apple. But Apple isn't stupid. It doesn't stop looking for cheaper people just because they signed a contract with you. And 6 months into your having done this, you get a call from Apple. Hello, I'm Apple. Is this whatever? Yes, I have got some bad news for you. We just got a bid to make that whatever it is you're making for 6% less than you're charging us. So you have, I don't know, 10 minutes to decide whether to meet this offer or we're going elsewhere. Going elsewhere? I just hired 450,000 Chinese workers who've all moved into this area in order to work here. I've invested millions in the machinery. I've bought trucks. Yes, very nice of you. You have 8 minutes left. At which point, the company really has no choice. It can't even verify if what Apple is saying to them is true or not. They have to agree, and they do. But that 6% cut that they had to give to Apple, because otherwise they die, now has to be dealt with. That was their profit margin. And they don't want to be in business to earn nothing. It's something many business people find distasteful. So they have to get it. And how are they going to get it? Well, maybe lunch can go from 19 minutes to 16 minutes. Maybe they can develop a new kind of bathroom that allows you to do what you do in the bathroom in 12 seconds. Maybe you can get the picture, or they can lower the wage, or they can, and this is the normal way business has been done by the large corporations in the United States ever since they began looking for cheaper ways of producing outside the United States, which is at least 40 years. So yes, is it interesting that Apple is doing it? Yes, that's interesting. Particularly for people who didn't know that any of this was going on, since it really is distressing to be aware of. This is the normal way business is done. There was a story today circulating on the internet that if you knew about the conditions under which the production of Valentine's Day flowers are produced, many of you wouldn't have bought them, or having received them, you would have given them back, since they have blood on. Well, it's serious. You just check it, you'll see. But again, being angry at the particular flower distributor is missing the point. It's a system that works this way. Everybody is sent the signal, this is how you do it. If you ask Apple, if they're honest, they'll tell you, if we didn't do that, you wouldn't all be excited about Apple because you wouldn't have bought an Apple. You would have bought a cheaper competitor of Apple who had done what Apple did sooner or better or even worse. So if you don't like the story of Apple, if it upsets you, if you wanted to think of it as a wonderful, progressive, technologically advanced company, and it is many of those things, then you're just discovering, kind of late, how this system works. It's very important, I think, to have that clear. Next item, and this one I'll be even briefer. Obama released a few days ago his projected budget for the coming fiscal year. And it is an interesting budget, but the first thing to understand is it's just his proposal. This is not the budget we'll have. That has to go through the United States Congress, which is where budgets are finally have to be passed. They're not, the president suggests, but that's all. It's the Congress that either passes it or not. And this Congress is not going to pass what he proposed. What he proposed is a whole set of taxes on richer folks. And that was interesting. That is interesting. He went further in that direction than he has in the past, a good bit further. And so it's interesting, and I think we should watch what this means. Is it purely election year talking to the people who've been disappointed with him and saying, well, I'm better than you thought I was, and that's it? Or is there something more to it? I'm going to come back to that a little bit later, but it is something that bears watching, particularly as we see how the Congress deals with that. Next item, before we get to some of the bigger ones. Republican candidates and quite a few Democrats have recently been rehearsing, restating a statement they have enjoyed for a long time, at least 50 years that I've been an adult and aware of what I do and what I think. I have heard this argument from conservative people. It goes something like this. We really have to cut back on things like Social Security and welfare and all of that. And the reason we have to do it, we have to do a service to the people who get it. Let's do that again. This is like I'm spanking the child with all my might and convincing myself and anyone who listens that I only do this for the benefit of the child, who will learn by this mechanism very important life lessons that couldn't otherwise be taught. The fact that I may be getting something out of whacking this kid is not to be discussed or even imagined. So we put that aside. Well, this is like that. We shouldn't give people Social Security and welfare. You know why? Because it makes them, ready? Dependent. That's not good. Yeah, lazy. They don't have any initiative. They don't go out and work. They lose, I believe Gingrich, they lose the work ethic. We're not doing them any favor. We're hurting them. And the only decent human thing to do is to take that benefit that we give to them and not give it to them anymore. I didn't make this up, and this is very old. Imagine then my enjoyment when I came across a piece of research recently done by a group I recommend to you. Those of you that are interested, and some of you have asked me, places to go on the internet where you can get good economic statistics and analysis that's understandable. It's not all hyped up with mathematics or anything like that, but it's understandable and on target in the ways you people like you and I are interested in. This is one of the best. It's called the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, cbpp.org if you want to look for it. CBPP, Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. And I found this interesting because it's in the news. So it's up here, and I will run over the numbers if you can't see them. The CBPP, which is a group that mainly does statistical analysis, did a study of who gets entitlement. Entitlement covers all of these things. Social Security, welfare, people who are entitled to some benefit from the government. These are the people targeted by our conservatives. So they took the numbers for the last full year that we have data, 2010, because the numbers for 2011 are still being processed and gathered. So 2010 is the last year for which we have numbers, and they did the calculations. And here's how it goes. People over 65, the elderly in this country, get 53% of all the entitlement money. Disabled people, they're under 65 but disabled, get 20%, okay, roughly. And the working household is roughly 18%. The reason it doesn't round out to 100% is because there are all kinds of errors and omission numbers, and they can't be certain where to allocate those. But these numbers are clearly indicated enough that a tiny minority of the people who get entitlement support are either young enough or physically able enough to work. They're not being pulled away from a work life or a work ethic. They're over 65 or they're disabled, the overwhelming majority. In other words, this conservative argument is a very nice story because it allows you to develop an argument for people who don't want to give benefits to people, a rationale for not doing it. The person who has to beat his or her child needs a rationale for doing that. And helping the child is really useful in that way. Avoiding people becoming welfare dependent is again, a story. Does it affect a handful of people? Probably it does. But it's not a significant part of what the entitlements in this country have been and are today, and it's useful, I think, to know that. Okay, I want to turn now to a discussion more focused on a couple of major issues. The first one is about the role of the state and the government in the economy. The reason I want to go through a little of that with you today is because the avalanche of silly stuff in the media, spewed by both commentators, politicians, and not a few academics, needs to be confronted because it is so pervasive. The argument runs something like this. We would all be better off, and our economy would work better if we just got the government out of it. The government is a burden. The government is inefficient. The government mixes in where it doesn't know what it's doing. The government is a pain. And we would all be better off. Our economic system would soar. We would avoid crises. We would avoid economic difficulty if we just got the government out of what it isn't supposed to be doing in the first place. This is really important idea. And I think the way to handle it is head on by explaining to you, as I'm going to try to do, that the government of the United States, and this is true of other countries too, but the government of the United States has been absolutely central and crucial in every way to this economy from day one through this afternoon. So the idea of an economy that is not burdened by the government is a phantasm. It's an imaginary. It has no content. And let me give you just a few examples so you can see this. And so you're not ever tempted to go down the road of this fantasy and have it be taken seriously. It is a metaphorical story, a little bit like entitlements are creating an America of working people who've lost the work ethic. No, it's old people and disabled people who are getting some help and who wouldn't be big on work ethic anyway. It's silly, but it has to be confronted. Let's go now with the government. Let's start with a simple thing, the money. The money. Who controls the money? Who prints the money? Who decides how much money is around? Who decides the terms on which the money is made available? The answer is, to a major extent, the government. And it has been, ready, the private sector of the United States that made it that way. In the early years of the United States, we did allow all kinds of banks and regional authorities to print and circulate money. We've actually experimented as a nation early in our history with not giving the government the monopoly of money. But that was such an unmitigated disaster over and over again that the business community said, stop. We don't want to do business with 27 kinds of money. One issued by the Eastern Kentucky Board of something, and another one issued by a bank in Chicago, and another. We don't want this. That's a, ready, chaotic monetary system. We don't want it. And so we're going to say only the United States government can print and circulate money, and if anyone else does it, we're going to throw you in jail, which is a tough kind of position to take. So the circulation of money, which most of you, I think, would agree is a rather important component of the economic system we have, is a monetary activity that is exclusively the domain of the government. And not even Ron Paul would question, well, maybe Ron would, that this is a reasonable way to proceed. But you can be sure that the overwhelming majority of the business community, The same businessman or woman who gives that Kiwanis speech on the fourth Monday of the month, waiting for dessert, and talks about getting the government out, the last thing on earth he or she wants is to have anybody else run the monetary system. That is to be a government activity. Number two, to give you an idea. As I've told you before, education in the United States, how we prepare young people to be citizens, to read, to write, to work, to have that work ethic that we talked about, that's done in the school system. And the overwhelming majority of people's education from kindergarten through PhD is done by the government. The government teaches, the government builds the schools, the government chooses the curriculum, and the government subsidizes most of the teaching and research that go on there. This is a government activity. And if we're proud of the productivity of our workers, then it's the government we have to thank for that, because that's where their skills and their capabilities are most developed. And even if you think that it's maybe true for elementary school and secondary school, where it's overwhelmingly the public system that educates, let me assure you it's true for the universities as well. Again, just to remind you, 15 million people, roughly, go to colleges and universities in the United States. About 3 million of them go to private colleges and universities. 12 million go to public. The government is the educator, and nobody else comes close. The role of the government is important in our economy. If you think the productivity of labor is important, then the government is absolutely crucial. Let me give you some more, just to give you a sense of where this goes. We are now an economy, and by the way, our president is pushing this, that is more and more dependent on exports and imports. We really do depend on them. You know, in the morning, some of you have heard this story, you get up in the morning and you have a cup of coffee, because for many of us, if we don't have that cup of coffee, we don't really get up, right? We're vertical, but it feels like we're not. So we need coffee. That coffee is not produced in the United States. We depend on the import of coffee. I understand there is a place in Hawaii where they produce coffee, which you can spend a fortune buying, but most of us don't drink that coffee, have never drunk that coffee. We all drink imported coffee. And the chances are, if we are given to sweetness, we put sugar in the coffee, and the sugar isn't produced in the United States either. So we have to have imported sugar in the imported, you get the picture. And if you have it in a paper cup, the paper probably comes from Canada. That's imported too. And on and on and on. Our Air Force depends on a jet engine. There are dozens and dozens of components of a jet engine that are not available in the United States. That is, the mineral and the metal isn't here. We depend on bringing that from other parts of the world. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a jet engine. And an Air Force without a jet engine is a hard concept. So we are really dependent on the rest of the world. Half of our oil, roughly, is coming in from the rest of the world. Try to imagine what that would mean if we didn't have that. So we are really dependent. We need to be able to bring that stuff here. And not just bring it here. We need to be able to bring it here at a reasonable price. Suppose we actually had to pay for the coffee. What would be necessary for the people in Brazil and Colombia and Kenya and those other places to have a decent life? Suppose they got paid for a decent life. And then your latte would be 20 bucks. So it's not only important that we be able to get the stuff, but we as a nation want to get the stuff cheap. And it turns out, I know this may be a hard concept, but it turns out that the people around the world who produce all the stuff we have to bring and who buy all that stuff we have to sell would often prefer if we paid them more, ready, more for what we got from them and charge them less for what we sell to them. And some of them would like to do something about that. And for that reason, we have a military. And the job of the military is to have 2,500 bases scattered around the world. We're the only country in the world that maintains a system of bases like that. Very, very expensive. We have troops all over the place. And they serve as a really subtle reminder to third world countries, don't mess around with the quantity and the price of what you sell to us and what you buy from us, because we will not be happy. And we will discover in your country an absence of freedom, which we will remedy soon, unless, of course, you realize the error of your ways. We have an enormous military which is extremely valuable to the economic functioning of our society. The happy notion that we don't need a government is a very strange idea. Let's stay with the military into another dimension. We spend more as a nation on military than most of the rest of the world combined. And the way our military work is they offer contracts to private companies to produce the things that the military needs. Aircraft, battleships, fancy guns, rockets, you know, all of that. And there's a long tradition of the military working out what used to be called a cost-plus contract. And here's how that works. The company that is going to build something for the military figures out whatever the cost of producing that thing is. And the military, the Defense Department, signs a contract giving them the cost of whatever it is the military buys, plus a reasonable profit. Now, I, as an economics professor, would have to tell you that that violates just about everything we teach. And the reason is simple. There's not really a whole heck of a lot of incentive for the defense producer to become cheaper about what he's producing. Because here's how a cost-plus contract works. Whatever the cost is, you get another 6%. Now here comes advanced math. Ready? The more you charge for the thing, the bigger 6% of it is. So you'll do better the less efficient you are. So when you hear about the Defense Department having been caught buying toilet seats for military bases at the hefty price of $806 per toilet seat, you are understanding the cost-plus arrangement. Nor is the military the only way that this goes. In most countries of the world, or at least in many countries, I haven't counted them all, so I shouldn't say most. In many countries of the world, here is how medicine is organized. The government goes to the drug companies and it says, hello, I'm the government of fill in the blank. And we have X million people in our society who need antibiotics and aspirins and all that. And we understand, because we went to Harvard, we understand that if you buy large quantities of medicine at a time, you get a better price than if you buy small quantities. You've always, many of you have noticed that. If you go to your local drugstore, you buy a container of 100 aspirin, it costs less per aspirin than if you buy one of those little things behind the counter that have 6 little aspirins in them, right? You've noticed this. Without going to Harvard, you saved a lot of money. You figured this out. So have countries. So they go to the drug companies and say, okay, I want 1 million batches of antibiotics, and so they work out to be 6 cents each, still making money for the drug company because it sells so many. Well, you might imagine, if you were naive, that the United States government, who has many people who went to Harvard in it, would also have put this concept together in some way and would have said, we're going to go to Pfizer or Merck or any of the small number of big drug companies in the United States, buy in a big bundle, and then redistribute at public clinics, hospitals, the same medicine at a small fraction of what we now have to pay. You would even have done that because you would be aware you would be aware that one of the motivations of older people in the northern part of the United States to get on uncomfortable buses for a long trip into Canada is because that's what they do. And so you can get the same medicine that in New York you pay $400 for $30 there. Same thing is true in Mexico. Same thing is true in many countries. We don't do that. We don't do that in the United States. That is a fantastic gift that the government gives to the drug companies and the drug industry. It became a matter of debate a year and a half ago. Remember when there was a big discussion about overhauling the drug? That was one of the issues that a few of the usual folks in the Congress proposed. You know, those odd ones, Bernie Sanders or Dennis Kucinich. People who are politically odd, and if you get to know them, they're also personally odd. But in any case, they're nice people and they mean well, but they're the ones. They're always the ones. And we're glad that they're there because compared to the others, they are the best we got by a long shot. But they were not able to prevail. The drug companies were able basically to do what the defense contractors do. So some of you are used to the phrase, the military-industrial complex, that famous line from President Eisenhower a long time ago, who warned about it, that conservative Republican president. But there really ought to be just as much talk about the pharmaceutical industrial complex, because it's really quite parallel kind of situation. And there are plenty of others. Next item. What maintains the transportation arteries, the things that get people to and from their job, to or from the connection between the house and the shopping in a consumer society? It is the roads, which are an activity of the government, which builds them and maintains them and does everything necessary so that the truck can get from here to there. But to give you an idea of how important that function is beyond the obvious, here's what. For most of the last half century, if you made a list of the 10 biggest companies in the United States, it's not true right now, but for most of the last half century, if you made a list of the 10 biggest companies, more than half of them would be in the automobile industry. They'd either make cars, or they'd be in the oil business, whose major consumer is the automobile, and so forth. Well, how did we have such a profitable automobile industry? How was it possible for us to become a rich country based on producing automobiles? The answer is that the automobile company had a fundamental difference from the railroad company, which was the previous way we got transportation done. A railroad company has to do two things. It has to produce the vehicle and what the vehicle rides on, the track. But the automobile company was relieved of one half of its costs. You just make the car. The government will make what the car goes on. Because if the government didn't do that, when you rode your Cadillac over the hills, it wouldn't be very comfortable, and you wouldn't have 6 of them. You wouldn't have bought any of them. It's uncomfortable. Try riding over the grass in your car. Not attractive. You need lots of road. The government provided the road. That's a subsidy to the automobile industry. An enormous subsidy to the automobile industry. Without the government doing that, there wouldn't have been a demand for cars anything like what we've had for the last half century, and our entire history as a nation would have been completely different. The government is a burden on the economy. We'd all be better off if it weren't there. What? What planet does this apply to? What is an idea of this? 2 or 3 more, and then I'll stop, because I think you will get, you'll get the idea. Here's something for you to think about. The number of capitalists, employers in our economy, is relatively small. whereas the number of people who are employees of capitalists is relatively large. Meanwhile, the large part is producing the profits gathered and enjoyed by the small part. You can see where this is going. It is possible, at some point, if people get on each other's nerves, that the large group will look enviously and resentfully at the little one. And they may then begin to do things. I don't know. It can start innocently enough. It's when you take a couple of the pencils at the desk where you work and inadvertently slip them into your pocket on the way home, where you remove them and don't take them back the next morning. And within 2 weeks, you're loading up your jacket every day. Right? This becomes a problem. Other workers graduate, sooner or later, to larger objects and come with a screwdriver to disconnect them from the floor into which they were anchored. And then all kinds of other things. You can see where this is going. This produces a problem for the small group of people who are capitalists. Because they really, if you think about it, they can't confront the large group, especially when the large group are upset. This is not going to go well. Enter the government. What the capitalist does when he notices that the sheer bulk of your sweater suggests you're the one who has removed all the manila file folders accumulated over 10 years in that office, they don't confront you. They don't say a word. They have a magical capability. They pick up the telephone, they dial 0 or 911, and suddenly, quickly, a dozen big guys in dark blue uniforms, brandishing sticks, arrive in vehicles to menace you and to tell you you must never do that again, or else they're going to hurt you. Who is this agency available to any employer the minute he or she feels threatened to come and completely change the balance of power? The government. If the capitalist didn't have the government, he'd face one of two options. He wouldn't be a capitalist much longer. That's not attractive. Or he'd have to, get ready, pay for this himself. He doesn't want that. He wants there to be a government whose people he can call when he needs them, but that, ready, you pay for. And better, you pay for willingly because it makes you feel more secure. Oh, what an achievement. Can you imagine a society in which the mass of people pay for the military apparatus that prevents them from changing the unequal economic position to which they are condemned for their lifetimes in this society? Sounds like a strange arrangement. Luckily, we don't have anything like that here. Last thing, and I love this one, so some of you bear with me in case I offend any of you. It's purely inadvertent. In our country, as you know, and if we had more time, I would bow my head and give this the respect that obviously it deserves. In our country, many of our fellow citizens, and I'm sure many of you, are deeply religious. You attend religious institutions 2 or 3 times a day. You pray, confess, beg, whatever it is your particular version of this entails. And I take off my hat. I'm impressed that you do that. However, I do notice that this activity of yours, going to and participating in religious institutions, is something that's very important to you, but for which you do not wish to pay. which I understand is a very American phenomenon. I want it, and I don't want to pay for it. And that's how our religious institutions work. I was reminded of this last week when one of our most important religious institutions, the Roman Catholic Church and its leading cardinals here in the United States, got very angry at President Obama's administration, because President Obama's administration said that Catholic institutions, not the church, but institutions affiliated with the Catholic Church, or indeed any church, it wasn't particularly the Catholics, would have to cover their workers, schools for example, with a medical insurance that had to include contraception. And the church said, we don't want to pay for contraception. It violates our religious commitment. And it is outrageous, they said, for the government to require us to do something that violates our religious commitments. And Obama backed off, came to a compromise with them.
Always.
Yeah. That wasn't me, that's from the audience. And so I wanted to respond only as follows. In the United States, all cities and towns depend above all, for a major part of their funding, on something called a property tax. Here's how that works. Every town has an official, the tax assessor, he or she is usually called. And their job is to go around and figure out what the value of a house is, of a store is, of a piece of land. And then that property is taxed. And that tax on the property owner, that's who has to pay. So if you own a piece of land, you have to pay tax. If you own a house, you have to pay tax on that. Often the cars are included. If you own the car, you have to pay property tax on that. And that goes to provide public schools for the young people in the community, the police department, the fire department, the public health department. You get the picture. That's what pays for it. Now, in our society, churches are exempt from the property tax. Let's go through this, okay? If you're a local Catholic church or Jewish synagogue or Muslim temple, whatever, doesn't matter, you don't pay. You may own land, you don't pay anything on it. You may own a building, the church, the synagogue, whatever, you don't pay on that. You may have a fleet of cars, you don't pay anything on that. You pay no property tax. However, ready? You get police services. If there's a problem, you call the police, they come. If there's a fire in your basement, you call the fire department, it comes. If you have a child, you send them in the public school system, the teacher has to accept them and treat them properly in the classroom. The churches get all the public services that they do not pay for. The church, on one side of the church, is O'Leary's bar. On the other side of the church is a hardware store. They make the same demands on the city that the church does. They have to pay property tax on the land, property tax on their building, property tax probably on their business inventories. The church pays nothing. Okay, if the church and the synagogue and the temple all get public services they don't pay for, it must mean, higher math, that somebody else is paying and not getting what they're paying for because somebody else is getting it. Which means that in every community of America, atheists, well, let's do it. Atheists have to pay property tax to support churches. If the atheists of America paid attention to what the cardinal said, they would be in court the next morning at 8 o'clock saying, hey, you're requiring us to pay for something we don't believe in. At which point the financing of our cities and towns would dissolve.
They're not organized like other religions.
They're not organized. Maybe there's a clue there. They're not organized. But the argument that we really live in a country where we oughtn't to be made to pay for something we don't believe in is another fantasy. We do that every day. Final example of that. The richest 50 Americans recently released a document indicating that they collectively gave about $11 billion to charity. And the purpose of the release of that press release, that happened 2 weeks ago, was to get us all to feel better about the 1%. Because after all, look at them. They're giving $11 billion. A nasty criticism pointed out that if you looked at the wealth that they have and you ascribe 5% per year on it, they were making more on their wealth than they were giving away. But put that aside. Here's what I want to talk to you about. Under the laws of the United States, when 50 wealthy people who are in a very high bracket, most of them live in New York City. If you live in New York City, you pay a federal income tax, a state income tax, and a city income tax. And it's easy to get into the realm of 45 or more % of what you earn has to be paid in taxes to all three of these administrations. That means if you're a wealthy person and you give away $1 billion, it reduces your taxable income by that amount. That's the law. So the decision by 50 wealthy people in New York to give away billions deprived the federal government, the state government, and the city government of hundreds of millions of dollars. That's the way the tax law works. So in order for the city and the state and the federal government to do all the things it does, since the rich got out of paying hundreds of millions, you get to make it up. So the next time a rich person tells you how generous he or she has been in their charitable contributions, remember, that contribution to the charity includes a hand in your wallet. And so be even more grateful than you might otherwise have been. Let me turn, in the time that we have left, to the topic many of you wanted me to talk a little bit about, and I'm going to do it in a general way. I'm going to start with the flashpoint in the world right now, the place where this economic crisis is crunching most intensely, is a little country of roughly 11 million people called Greece, which has been in the focal light for quite a while now, for several years. But clearly, a small country like that, with a small population, in a little corner of Europe, couldn't possibly be the center of attention by virtue of its own economic weight. That would make no sense. That would be as if we were here and night after night I talked to you about the serious problems of Northeast Rhode Island. And you would all be going, what? Why is he talking about Northeast Rhode Island? Well, why are we talking about Greece? So there has to be some other reason other than olives and flowers and octopus and other things that are remarkably interesting from Greece. That's not why we're talking about it. What happened in Greece is literally, where would it be more appropriate? It's a modern day tragedy, like the Greeks invented, after all. It's a modern day tragedy. And to give you some of the dimensions, unemployment now, and I have really good authority for this, I look a lot at 2 or 3 Greek banks that issue by far the best economic analysis of the Greek economy that I found. Much better than any government are these Greek banks, who will rise or fall and dissolve depending on how this gets resolved, because they are deep into it. Unemployment rate is now about 22%, which is, by the way, what it is in Spain as well. So it's not just a little country. Big countries have this. 22%. That's the level of unemployment of the Great Depression. At the worst point of the Great Depression in the United States, 1933, the official unemployment rate in the United States was 25%. Greece and Spain are now right close to that. Try to get a sense what it means. That's an unemployment 3 times what we have here, roughly. So we think we have a major unemployment problem, and we do, but theirs is 3 times larger. The deal just signed by the Greek government, a coalition government of 3 parties, has as one of its steps the reduction of the minimum wage by 22% to take effect immediately. Reduction of the incomes of the poorest people by 22%. The total number of public employees in Greece is 800,000, roughly. The agreement just signed requires the government to fire 150,000 over the next year and a half of those 800,000. This is in a country that already has 22% unemployment. You're now taking another 150,000 out of the total number of 800,000. Some of you may have seen a remarkable event, also happened this last month. A hospital in northern Greece, which can no longer function, the interns, the doctors, the nurses took over the hospital, withdrew from the hospital system, and are now running a worker-controlled, worker-directed hospital. If I had more time, I'd talk to you about it. So the attack on Greece, the punishment of Greece, is staggering in terms of what's going on. That is a society being driven into a state of economic distress that is really beyond what anybody could have foreseen or did foresee, with very few exceptions, as little as a year ago. And more is coming. The current deal is being held up by the central bank and the IMF because they want another $300 or $400 billion worth of cuts beyond those that have been agreed to, therefore requiring more of what I just said. Stupefying. And before I go on and talk about what it means and where it goes, let me drive home, if I can, the most important point. That whole business of Greece is a laboratory effort to see how far you can push the working class in modern, industrial, advanced countries. That, unless things change, is our future being played out. And depending on how that gets worked out, we're going to have a big clue as to what is at least going to be tried on us, since the problems are very similar. First thing to look at. I got the results of public opinion. I believe it's called public opinion. It's the best known poll. And these are poll results over the weekend, this last weekend. So it's the most recent of what political parties the Greek people now support as they go through this staggering event. I'm not going to talk about what I assume all of you saw. Over the weekend there were huge riots in the streets of Athens. 40 buildings were torched. Hundreds of people were injured, some quite seriously. Pitched battles between young people and the police, and so forth and so forth and so forth. But here's what I want you to see. These are the poll results. Okay, and I explained to you what they are and what they mean. This is not a country. These are the initials of a right-wing party in Greece. A seriously right-wing party, very anti-immigrant. Greece has a big population of immigrants from places like Albania and elsewhere. That's a big social problem. And they take a strong anti-immigrant position. They're part of the government now. There are 3 parties in the government. The Laos Party, PASOK, I'll tell you in a minute about them, and New Democracy, which is what ND. That's the coalition that now governs Greece. It used to be governed just by this party. That's the Papandreou party, but now it's a coalition because Papandreou resigned a few months ago. 5% of the people of Greece support the most right-wing party. Given the amount of attention it gets in the world, that's stunning. A major player, a lot of attention, 5% of Greeks support it. More dramatic than that, the Socialist Party, which in 2009, when it was coming into the government, commanded 40% of public opinion polls, now gets 8%. the reward for a socialist government that implemented an austerity program over the last 3 years, savaging the working class, destroyed its own political base. All of you should think, what does it mean in the long, complex history of socialism and of left-wing political parties and all that they represent? How could it come to be that a socialist government, and remember Papandreou was the son and the grandson of leaders of Greek government before. It's like a dynasty there, like Kennedy's or something here. So a popular leader from a popular family in a small country where everybody knows everybody anyway, that's 8%. That's all they have. New Democracy, that's the right wing, the right half of the conservative, let's call it. The real right wing is them. They're the biggest, 30.5%. But now come and watch with me. Syriza, that is a far left alliance of left-wingers. They get 12% of the vote. This is the Communist Party of Greece. It gets 12.5% of the vote. And this is a moderate but leftist political party, gets 18. Well, do the math. Half of the Greek people are on the left. Half of the Greek people want a left government. All of these parties are opposed to the austerity program. And that's why they're not in the government. This is the government. This is the opposition. Put the numbers together. The Greek people don't want what they're going through. And they're showing it in the most dramatic way imaginable. When the vote was taken at the end of the last week, the biggest defections ever seen in the Greek parliamentary life happened. Six members of the cabinet resigned rather than go with the vote to support the austerity. Dozens of deputies in the parliament broke with the decision to support their party and were therefore immediately expelled by the party. So much so that the headlines, the amused headlines in Greece were, after the vote, the second biggest block of parliamentary delegates was those who opposed everything, who were no longer members of any party because they'd been expelled by their party. They were the second biggest block. This is a society whose polarization, as you can now see, because remember, this is a party that officially is a socialist party. So if you bring them down here, then we're talking a clear majority. If PASOK wanted to be united with these three, that would be a stone-cold majority, and that would take Greece either out of the European Union or out of the Eurozone, or in any case, not allow what's going on to continue. The great issue in Greece is whether, political issue, such a unity of the left is conceivable, will be managed by these parties. If it happens, you're going to have a fundamental civil clash. You're going to have a majority of the people from below opposed to what the government is and does on the most fundamental level of what happens in the economy. That's really only 3 steps before civil war. And that's where things are being pushed. Not to see this, which the press in the United States doesn't see, but not to see this is to miss what may become, and in a short time, the overwhelmingly dominant story, because something very similar is happening in Italy, in Portugal, in Spain, in Ireland, in Hungary, and so on. With other countries, one wonders. What is going on, to conclude? Capitalism, I would argue, is not working. Capitalism as a system is producing results that are calling into question its tolerability. Europe which had a fantastic plan, having engaged in unspeakable slaughter of one another in World War I and World War II. The decision was made after World War II to try to do something to stop what has been hundreds of years of internecine warfare in Europe, costing unspeakable amounts of lives and lost property and lost wealth. And the project was initiated to unify Europe. And to unify Europe, the whole idea was to do it in a way that would bring the countries closer together, that would give them a solidarity, then they wouldn't go to war against one another, to share in the benefits and the costs of social life in an equitable way so that they would be brought closer together, even in bad times, rather than turn on each other with vicious attacks that lead into war. All of that is falling apart. The unification of Europe that happens at the end of the 1990s, a process that had been going on slowly before that, but now creates a common market, now creates a common currency, and so forth, has now come to the point where Germany is a country that has 4 or 5% unemployment, doing pretty well, and is a few kilometers from a country that I just described in Greece. The biggest creditor of Greece is Germany. German banks are the biggest creditor of the Greek government outside of Greece. The Germans entered the unification of Europe with a great anxiety. Understandable. Now that Europe was to be one place, why would anyone continue to produce in Germany, where wages were relatively high, as opposed to moving production to Greece or Portugal or Spain, where costs of production were relatively low? That's what the economics textbooks predicted. And that would have made a certain sense because Germany was a more developed economy, and so it would lose a little, but there would be growth in the other places that had been traditionally much poorer, and so there would be more of an equilibration, which is what the unification of Europe had kind of in mind as a key basis for harmony and the end of war. The problem is, of course, that German industry would rather stay in Germany than go elsewhere. It's costly to move. There's some risks. Your relationships aren't so good with Greek legislators the way they are with German legislators. So the German government and German industry did, understandably, it tried to figure out how not to get shafted by this unification. And they worked it out. They came to an arrangement with the trade unions in Germany. They said to the workers, understandably, you know, if we leave here and go to the cheaper workers in Greece and Spain and Portugal and Ireland and Hungary and Slovenia and so on, it's not going to be good for you. You're going to lose your job. So how about we have a deal? You accept no wage increases. We don't have to raise our prices. And you keep your jobs. Done, said the socialist unions. They wanted to hold on to their jobs. So the Germans could not raise their prices. Wow. So as the economy of Europe developed, the Germans cashed in. Not only did they not lose, they stayed in Germany. And because their prices didn't go up, everybody else in Europe began to buy German goods rather than their own goods, which went up in price. Because they had people who wanted to participate in what the European Union had promised, prosperity to everybody. Join in the big new thing, you will have peace and you'll have prosperity. Yeah, well, the only way to get prosperity in those poor countries was to borrow the way to prosperity. Something we Americans should understand, because when the wages stopped rising in America after the 1970s, how did the American standard of living keep going up over the last 30 years when the wages didn't? We borrowed, just like them. But you know, after a while, if your wages are flat, and the only way you can increase your standard of living is by borrowing, you don't need rocket science to understand eventually you'll have a level of debt you can't support on a flat wage. The American working class discovered that, which is why we're in a crisis now. And the Greeks discovered it, which is why they're in a crisis now. And the Spanish working class is discovering it. And here in this country, who lent to the working class for 30 years? The business community, who were making a lot of money because the wages were flat for 30 years, and so they cashed in. And they made a lot of money, which they turned around and lent to the workers. Who lent to the Greeks? The Germans, who made a lot of money because they kept their prices down and nobody could compete with them. And so they made a ton of money, which they lent to the poor countries to allow them to keep buying the stuff produced in the rich countries. But when it can't do it anymore, it's over. And you know, here's the irony of ironies. Because the Greeks can't do anything anymore. They have no money. They can't keep their hospitals open. They can't buy anything. 500 gas stations in Greece, small country, have closed in the last year and a half. People aren't buying enough gas to make them viable enterprises. So first it's Greece, but already you see the effect on Germany. Germans sell to Spain, to Portugal, to Italy. People aren't buying. The Germans are discovering, oh my goodness, having taken everything to ourselves, having lent for a while to the others so we could keep selling to them, now we're not going to lend to them anymore because they can't pay us back. But if we don't lend to them, they can't buy from us. And if they don't buy from us, we're in the soup with them. The system self-destructs. Capitalism is not only, as I said at the beginning, not working for societies like Spain, Italy, Greece, and on and on. It isn't even working for the other ones. Britain is having a decrease, a recession. The Germans suspect they're going to go into recession this year. They too are faced. It's like the United States. The 1% takes it all. The 99% can't buy anything. And the 1% discover if the 99% can't buy anything, we're shafted. We need them. We need them to buy all this crap. We need them. We need them. The system doesn't work. It is destroying itself. It doesn't need an external enemy, however much we imagine them. We're doing it internally because the system doesn't. The signals sent to all the players produce responses which collectively destroy the system. Why is that important? Because it is the negation of one of the founding myths of the capitalist system, articulated by the founder of the economics of that system, Adam Smith. He had the theory of the invisible hand. Let me remind you what he said. If every person and enterprise pursues his own immediate economic self-interest, we will be led as a society to the best possible economic outcome. It will be as though, Adam Smith, each of us was led by an invisible hand. And for those of you that are not into this, let me explain. Okay? God. Adam Smith was a professor of religious studies up in Edinburgh in Scotland. So Adam Smith was explaining, it's all right, he said. We can each of us pursue our own immediate economic self-interest. The company, maximum profits. The worker, maximum income. We can all do whatever is necessary to get the most, and we don't have to worry at all because it will be as if by an invisible hand, the market will be like an invisible hand. The market is the agent of God to guarantee that each of us pursuing our self-interest will produce the best outcome. You may giggle and laugh, but most of the economics profession that I have grown up with and worked with all my life basically believes that and teaches it. What we're discovering, though, is that under certain circumstances, like the present, the pursuit of by each economic actor of his or her own immediate self-interest can not only produce not the greatest good for the greatest number, but the complete implosion of whole economic systems around the world. This is a time, not to end with too much drama here, but this is a time of extraordinary economic turmoil and change in which people's basic attitudes, basic assumptions about economic life, basic notions of what's likely to be their personal as well as economic futures are being transformed. And the consequences of that are going to play themselves out for years to come, no matter what happens in Greece. But Greece is the flashpoint, and it deserves being focused on. Last thing for today. When capitalism has often gotten itself into trouble, the following has happened. A crisis happens, whether it's the Great Depression, whether it's the one in 2007, or it's the mild one in the early 1980s, or it's the more severe one in the middle of the 1970s, or whichever one it was. You always have the following kind of debate. One group says, do nothing. The system heals itself. That's the Republicans are concerned. Let it be. Get the government out of there, don't do anything. Second approach, bring the government in, regulate everything, and then it'll be all right. And so sometimes it happens, and we have a regulated private capitalism. Still private people running the companies, still private shareholders, still private owners, but under a lot of government pressure, a lot of government regulation. Sometimes that's not enough. Sometimes private capitalism has such a crisis that lasts so long that regulation-type people lose favor, the beginning of a shift of opinion like you see in Greece, which is a few months or years ahead of us, so you see what's coming. Then what happens is we give up on private capitalism. We go over, and the state doesn't just regulate. The state is called in to take another step, take over the enterprise. Russia in 1917. Were there people in the revolution of Russia in 1917 who just wanted to go to a regulated capitalism? Absolutely. Some of you may remember, if you read the famous leader, Kerensky was his name. He was a socialist who wanted the government to play a role, a little bit like modern European socialists. And for a while he was in charge, but it was only a matter of weeks and months. And then he was pushed aside by Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin, who had another idea. The government would basically throw out the private owners and operators of capitalism, and the state would take over, which it did. But the interesting thing was, they never quite went the final step. You still had inside the Soviet factories what? Group of workers who come to work all day, produce an output, and then they go home. And the decision what to do with the output, the decision what to do with the profits of that enterprise were still made by a group of people other than those workers. They weren't private board of directors selected by shareholders, that's private capitalism. They were state officials sent in by the government to run the operation. And guess what? Lenin, who was a very smart fellow, said, this is important what we've done, but it isn't socialism. He called it state capitalism. Lenin's phrase. We're going to go further, he said. This is just a way station. They never got further. That's where they stopped. And then they had a crisis. And then think of the irony of the twist of history. When the state capitalism of Russia had its big crisis in the 1970s and 80s, what did the people there think of as the only way to go? To go back to what they had had before. In their world, there were two options, either private capitalism or state capitalism. They called state capitalism socialism. They saw it as the alternative. What they didn't think of was that, wait a minute, there's another thing we haven't talked about. Suppose the state gets rid of the private capitalists, but instead of replacing them with state officials, we reorganize enterprises, and the workers themselves collectively run the enterprises, not state officials. Would that be an alternative that maybe would get us out of the history of capitalism, which is a history of a system that cannot avoid the kinds of crises we're in, and that imagines that the only option when you're in a crisis is if you have private capitalism, move over to state capitalism, and if you have state capitalism, move over to private capitalism. What a sad society. For 300 years of modern capitalism, every time a crisis has happened, the leaders of the society have come up with something to do about it and have said about their plans and policies, people of our country support our new policy, whoever they were, the leaders, because if you do, it'll get us out of the crisis and, pregnant pause, and make sure we do not face such a crisis again. Every leader has promised it. No leader ever delivered that promise. Is that because they were liars? I don't think so. They hoped. They meant well. But they couldn't. And the reason they couldn't is they didn't know how to get beyond capitalism. They only changed one form to another, from a private capitalist to a state capitalist. The idea of changing the system as a whole, reorganizing production, that remained an elusive idea. That idea's time has now arrived. Because for masses of people, even if they can't put it into the language I'm using now, there is dawning the idea we're not going to go through another pointless oscillation from private to state or state to private, because both of them leave us in an economic system that is unjust and is vulnerable to the crises that destroy us and often bring us into war. We have to find an alternative. That, in my humble opinion, is the greatest hope for a breakthrough from what we are talking about in these monthly meetings that I can find and that I can see. And so you notice I talk about it from time to time because it's the only way forward. Thank you very much for your attention. We have a very few minutes, but if there are some questions people want to raise, please speak quickly and I will repeat so that everyone can hear.
It's a short question. The figure that you mentioned for Greek unemployment, the 22%, do they weigh their unemployment statistics the way we do in this country, where if you stop looking for a job, you're not technically considered unemployed?
It's a good question. The question is, how do the Greeks measure unemployment? The question is good for two reasons. One, the measurements are often very strange, and they vary from country to country. So if you actually look at agencies that try to compare one country to another, they have to make all kinds of adjustments to get them comparable. Having said that, I have to plead ignorance. I don't know the details of how the Greeks measure. Here in the United States, what your question is about, to make sure everybody understands, the government figures out unemployment in this country as follows. It does a random survey, and it picks a person, could be you, and they ask you two questions, or maybe even three. First question, are you working? If your answer is yes, I'm working, you're an employed person. If your answer is no, I'm not working, you're asked another question. Are you looking for work? If you answer yes, I am looking, then you are considered an unemployed person. If you answer no, I'm not looking, you're not considered to be in the labor force, and therefore you're not counted at all. So for example, if everything stays the same from 1 month to the next, except 1 million people who were looking last month have said, I'm disgusted, there are no jobs, I'm not looking anymore, and they give that answer the next month, unemployment will go dramatically down only because the people who still are unemployed this month and last are no longer looking. And so it would show up as a drop in the unemployment rate. Unemployment would drop, as it did, for example, last few months, from roughly 9% to roughly 8.5%. You'd have to look at the details to know whether that was in any sense a drop in what most of us mean by unemployment. So the question of what the Greek numbers mean would require you to know exactly how they do it, and I just don't know. Is anyone here who does? Okay, well, at least I'm not alone. Sir?
I once asked an economist in passing how economists factor peak oil into their models, and he just said they don't. And I have a friend who's a physicist who said, you know, we've taken all the oil and we've turned it into all these people. And, you know, I wonder if what's going on is peak oil means that there's less energy to burn, less economic activity is possible, and so they're just trying to put people out of work to hold the price of gasoline down. And what brought that to mind was when you said they closed 500 gas stations in Greece. I mean, maybe that's basically what's happening.
I think the question is about peak oil and the question about whether if we are in a period of time when there's less and less oil available to sustain modern economies that are very oil dependent, could we be in a kind of global adjustment to the declining availability of oil? And the first part of what the gentleman said is absolutely true. The answer to the question is, how does the economics profession, when it figures out what's going on, take account of peak oil? The answer that my colleagues would give is they knew about Exxon and they knew about Texaco, but the peak company they hadn't heard of yet. In other words, they had no idea about any of that. It doesn't factor in at all. It's as if it's not there. It's a debate which economists, with very few exceptions, pay no attention to. And there are many such debates. As to whether or not we are accommodating the cut in oil, I don't know. That may be part of what's going on. I will tell you, though, that in any society that has become as universally dependent on oil as we have, if you're going to reduce your dependence, if you don't do that in a planned, socially conscious way, it's going to end up being managed by the market. And the way the market does that is it bids up the price of a scarce commodity like oil so that the only people who can afford it are those with the money to pay the rising price. That means the real cost of a diminished access to oil will fall on those least able to pay. That produces social conflict of the most dire kind. How do we know that? We know that from the history of the United States and many other countries. But I'll give you the history of the United States, which proves it. During World War II, when the United States went to war against the Germans, the Italians, the Japanese, the United States realized it's going to have to use a lot of resources now to fight the war, to build the ships and the tanks and the bullets. Those resources would have to be withdrawn from the civilian economy to make it available to produce for war. That would mean less gasoline to run the cars of Americans in the 1940s, less milk to feed the children because the animals couldn't be fed, the fertilizer couldn't be produced for the grain, and all the rest. So the United States government made the following decision. May amaze you. We cannot let the reduced resources, like in your peak oil example, the reduced resource, which included oil in those days, we cannot let that be distributed by the market, because that will mean the rich will get the little resources that are left and everybody else will have nothing. That, the government, Roosevelt, that will create such tension between rich and poor that it will, ready, undermine the war effort. We'll lose the war. That's not possible. Therefore, now my language, not theirs, but it's irrefutable. We cannot rely on a market. It gets results that are politically intolerable. Screw the market. It's gone. And the United States government issued ration tickets. It distributed ration tickets to everybody in the United States on a criteria that had nothing to do with your money. You were given a ration ticket according to your, get ready, to each according to their needs. If you had a big family, you got a lot of tickets. If you had a little one, no. If you had sick people, you got extra tickets because they needed the milk or they needed the fresh fruit or whatever it was. And to buy something in a store, you had to have two things, the money and the ration ticket. The money alone, you don't get it. Goods were not distributed by the market because it was socially intolerable. That's a sign of a society that understands it is dangerous to allow markets to work. In a society like ours that raises the market to the level of a religious icon, it cannot recognize what I just said and is therefore condemned to live with the consequences of how markets do things. Greece is an example of the consequences of how markets do things. And it's a very dangerous image of where we